Hey y'all, it's Mr. J. I wanted to give you some writing exercises that you could do at home to keep your writing up since we can't meet in school. And I thought I would start with something easy and kind of fun. The topic is the writing process. And you can see I've listed the main points of the writing process here. You always begin with brainstorming, research, which is something some people really don't like to do. I know it took me a while to get into research, but I think you'll find the research for this particular assignment to be pretty fun. Then you draft, then you revise, and then you edit, and then you publish. I'm going to walk you through all of these with the example writing assignment for today. For example, it's probably worth mentioning what the difference is between revising and editing, because some people think those are the same. Starting with, so the kind of writing that I think you might have fun doing is writing a recap. I actually used to do this as a job, and it can actually be really fun and really interesting, and you can learn a lot by doing it. So not all writing, has to be the kind of writing where, you're being tested or graded. I think you might enjoy this type of writing. So a recap is usually it's a little bit different from a review. A review would be saying whether or not something is good or bad. Like, so if you review a movie or a play, you would tell someone at the end, at some point in the review, if it was a good play or if it was a bad movie. A recap isn't so much about whether the movie or the TV show was good. It's just kind of giving us the basic plot points of the show, maybe some context, so that somebody who can't watch it, or maybe has watched it but wants to sort of think about it a little bit longer, can get all the information they need. Sometimes we watch TV shows and we're not really sure what happens, and so it helps to read a recap to see if you're, getting it right. So one of the things that I'm going to do, send along with this video, is a couple examples of some really good recaps. So that would, I think, be a bit part of your brainstorming or research phase, is actually reading other recaps. Brainstorming. So if you're going to write a recap, you need something to watch. And I know a lot of you are probably binge watching something. Now, you probably don't want to recap an entire, let's say, streaming series or television series. Take the example of the series Game of Thrones. To recap the entire season or series of Game of Thrones would take a whole lot of writing. So oftentimes recaps are focused on just one episode of a series. So I think that would be a good goal to set, is to pick a favorite episode or a recent episode of a show you've been watching or binge watching. That's your kind of brainstorming task right now. And so if you wanted to kind of go through these steps with me, you could stop the video for a minute, take a few minutes, and think about shows that you've watched recently, and think about particular episodes that you would like to spend a little bit more time with. That's the brainstorming phase. Research is really, I think, fun in this assignment, because you're going to go back and watch the episode that you're going to recap. So if you want to do that now, go ahead, pause the video, switch over to Netflix or Hulu or Prime or whatever it is you watch, TV, and re-watch the show. Now, when you're doing the research, it's not a bad idea to take a few notes. Some of us have the kind of memory where we just remember everything that everybody says. In that case, you probably don't need to take very many notes. But I like to take a few notes. When I wrote recaps or when I reviewed films, I would always bring a little notepad with me, just in case I had a really good idea that I needed to jot down. So that's the research. Drafting and again, if you want to pause the video here in a second for you to write your draft, is in some way the hardest part, right? It's sort of the bulk of the work. You're going to want to make sure that your recap hits the major points of the plot, right? Now, here's the thing. In order for a recap to cover the basic elements of the plot of the episode, you may have to introduce us to some of the characters. Remember, think about your audience here. This is probably somebody who's watched the show before, but they may have missed a few things. Is there a character that comes up that has never been introduced before in this episode? If so, you might also want to introduce them. That being said, if you're, say, back to the Game of Thrones example, most of us pretty much know the major players of that series, and so you don't necessarily need to explain every single character's role if it's something you can count on people already know. But it's always a judgment call how much information to leave in, how much information to leave out. Another thing that's really great about recaps, and you'll see this from the examples, is that often they have a lot of the writer's voice in them. A sense of humor. Sometimes it's a sense of kind of nerdy detail about the things that the recapper has about the particular topic that's being covered in the show. I'm thinking of certain kinds of Criminal Minds or kind of like murder shows where if you happen to be a forensic scientist, you can actually weigh in on whether or not they get the science right in the television show, and I think those recaps can be kind of valuable. So you definitely want to maybe show off any knowledge you have. But of course, one very important thing about a recap is that if you are about to spoil something that comes later in the show, some specialized knowledge, then you often want to give somebody a warning that, that you're about to do that, in which case you would just use the conventional phrase, spoiler alert. Revising and editing are different. Revising involves making large structural changes to the draft. And that's true of just about any draft. With recaps, when you're revising, you want to spend some time away from the piece and then come back, look at it, depending on how much time you have. I used to write under a deadline, so I didn't have a lot of time to revise, but I would sort of revise as I went. And sometimes I would write a paragraph and I thought, you know what, this paragraph is really good and make a great introduction or great opener for the piece. And sometimes I'd write a paragraph and think, oh, this is fine. It should definitely stay in the article, but I'm just going to save it for the end in case somebody, I don't want them to get bored in the middle of the piece and stop reading it. Editing is really where you bring in your proofreading skills. You can always have somebody else look over it, but really, just looking for the basics of, do you have good grammar, good spelling, look for the sentences that no longer need to be there, cutting unnecessary clutter. That's the editing phase. And then publishing, I think, you have a real opportunity here. I'll also suggest some places when I send along the materials for the examples of the recaps, but there are all kinds of places on the internet where you can post recaps and people might actually read them. It depends on the show, and it depends on how big of a fan base or how obsessive a fan base the show has, but publishing the recap, I think, is something you might consider doing, especially if you spent time on it, because you never know. People might like reading it, and then you might end up becoming a recurring recapper of a show. Sometimes a following online can develop that way. So this is real writing in real time using the real writing process, and I think it'll be fun. All right, take care, and I'll be back later with another lesson.